I will say for Zach and I, we appreciate being appreciated. So it is a blessing to work with the congregation here. It's a privilege, and we are grateful for that. This morning, we're going to do essentially a continuation of the sermon series that we're kind of working our way through Luke. And when you go through Scripture, there are some passages that are easier to kind of walk through in a Bible class, and some that are a little easier to preach through. And these are a little easier to walk through in a Bible class, and so it kind of worked out well that this is kind of when the time frame fell. And so we're going to kind of finish out chapter 2 this morning. We're going to hop over just a little bit into chapter 3 and look at some things related to the baptism and genealogy of Jesus. As we get into this discussion this morning, what I hope that we see is a little bit more of just kind of thinking intently about why are things in Scripture as they are? What are these here? What are these here for? Turn that on. It'll be helpful. There we go. So last week our focus was on the birth of Jesus, which is, again, for a lot of cultural reasons. A lot of people are focused on that this time of the year. But our focus was on kind of what was going on there. We talked about the joy and all of the good news that was associated with that. And so we discussed that last week. And as we kind of keep that in mind this morning to start off, what kinds of words would you use to describe the attitude of Luke 2, 1 through about verse 38? What we studied last week. What kind of words would you use to describe what's going on with the birth of Jesus?
Good news.
Okay, good news. I would say excitement. I think it's a text where, as I talked about last week with the opening 7 verses, you read the birth of Jesus, and probably you and I have maybe stories that are cooler that we could share about somebody's birth. God keeps it very low key. I mean, there's nothing crazy in the birth account itself. It's what follows that gives us all of this idea of the good news and joy and excitement. You have the angel, you have then the angels, you've got Simeon, you've got Anna, you have all of this buildup. And then what happens next? What would if you were writing, right? If you were writing the story, and I know obviously this is true, not a story, but if you were writing the story, what would happen next? What would you expect? I think big things. If he's been born and change is here and we're all excited, you would expect things are different and things are going to be radical right now. And what do you get? 30 years, essentially, of things continuing as they were until the ministry of Jesus begins. And so it's very interesting that God gives us this good news and then it kind of sits. And I don't know if you want to say it stews, but it just kind of remains. It's coming, but it's not yet here. Even though Jesus has been born, there's this waiting period that we enter into. And so what we're going to look at this morning is kind of where do we go from the birth of Jesus until the ministry of Jesus. A span of 30 years. Jesus begins his ministry at about the age of 30. And so we're going to look at the situations that unfold right here, starting with verses 39 and 40 real quick in Luke chapter 2, if you want to open up there. It says this. This is after where he goes to the temple as essentially a newborn, an infant, and there's the praise for him there. And then it says, and when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. And so you get this snapshot, this very small, brief window of Jesus is born, and then we get his childhood encapsulated, essentially, in a few of these words here. And so the first thing we're told is that Jesus grew up in the city of Nazareth. How many of you grew up in a place that no one else would know where it is? Anybody have kind of a community like that? So I grew up in a little town called Goldsby, Oklahoma, and the only reason that you would know it is there is you needed gas, and then you asked, hey, where am I? And they would tell you. And on the interstate, there's an exit for Goldsby on the north side, and if you're coming from the south as well. So you might have driven past it and say, and then kept going. But there's nothing to it. It's nothing of great importance. There was no school there. There's no downtown. It's just kind of a farm community with lots of houses all over the place. Nothing there. Nazareth kind of strikes us the same way. There's not much about Nazareth that is significant. In fact, if you were coming up with the story of the Messiah, you'd probably have him born in Jerusalem. and living in Jerusalem and learning under the greatest teachers of the law and all of these things. And yet here is Jesus, and he grows up. He's born in Bethlehem, and he's growing up in the city of Nazareth. One of the only things we have about the city comes to us from the book of John. At the beginning of the Gospel of John, John recounts for us Jesus calling people to follow him. And one of the situations we find is two guys named Philip and Nathanael. Listen to what happens here. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." We found the guy. Listen to Nathanael's response. "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." And so from the little bit we can take from that, Nazareth was not this place where everybody was thinking, man, we are waiting for somebody big to come out of Nazareth. It's a place where there was nothing of great importance, it seems like, and yet here is where God has Jesus raised, grow up, and ultimately that's kind of the picture we get that Jesus grew. This is a really hard concept to get your mind around because he's Jesus, he's God in the flesh, and yet we're told that he grew. That in some regard, and we see this in Philippians chapter 2, Jesus became a person. He put on flesh, and he limited himself in some capacity in being of flesh, right? He ate, and he drank, and he slept, and all the things that humans do. Well, he also grew, and he grew in wisdom and in favor with God. And I want you to keep those two ideas in mind. We'll see that again in just a few minutes, and we'll kind of bring that together. So this is essentially the childhood of Jesus. This is about the only thing that we have about Jesus' from birth until his ministry. There's only one other significant event, and that's what we see next. One specific thing highlighted for us from the life of Jesus as a child. And so Luke records this for us, and I want to ask a question before we read it. Caleb is almost 12, so he'll be 12 in just about a month. There's a lot that's happened in our life in 12 years, and a lot that's happened in his life for him, 12 years. Jesus, there's one event recorded for us of Jesus' childhood, essentially, outside of the birth and shortly thereafter, maybe with the wise men and the fleeing to Egypt. In all of the New Testament, if this is the one thing that's written, what does that maybe tell us? What should that indicate to us? It's important. There's some reason why of all the stories of Jesus' childhood that could have been shared, that this is the one. Now, I don't mean it, I don't know fully, right, what all Jesus did as a child, but this was important enough that Luke said, I need to write this. This one needs to be here. God wanted us to see this. And so I think this is important. Now, as we read it, I think we might expect something like the life of Jesus. We might, and you'll see this when I was studying for this, there are other people's, other writings that come after that aren't considered to be from God. People wrote other things that we would not say are authoritative. They're not from God, but stories about Jesus. And I think probably made up. It would probably be a lot of them. But stories and about Jesus doing miraculous things. And some of them were like I read one account of, he struck another child dead because he did something, which doesn't make any sense that Jesus would do that because that doesn't fit with anything. But you can see how all these fanciful accounts would come up, right? People would try to make backstory for Jesus. Here, we're not given anything that's what we would call miraculous. It's not one story of Jesus doing something like, he parted a puddle in front of his parents' house or something like that. There's nothing where you might say, hey, this is how we knew Jesus was the Messiah as a child. It's not that kind of thing. It's a very different situation that we're walking into here. And so read with me in verses 41 and following. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it. But supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem, searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So again, of all the childhood stories that we could all share from our own lives, and there would be many, right? Jesus, this Messiah, the most important person, right, to ever live, we get one. And it's one of Jesus in the temple. And so let's just kind of walk through the account here. It happens during the Passover. If you're unfamiliar, somebody give me just a brief synopsis of what is the Passover.
God saving the people from the wrath they had against Egypt.
Okay, so God, way back, and we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years prior to this day that Jesus is alive, they're in Egypt, they're enslaved, and God brings all of the plagues, and then eventually he gets to the final one. He's going to send the angel of death, going to strike down all the firstborn of all the Egyptians. The Israelites are told, you take this lamb, you shed its blood, you paint the blood on the doorpost of the house, you eat this meal, you eat this lamb, and then you're going to leave, right? And this was not just a singular event, but it was supposed to be remembered every single year. Right, every single year. And you think about even the time frame of the year that we're in. We've got holidays, we've got Thanksgiving and Christmas and all of these things, and there's traditions built around those things. And for most of us, we don't know the first time this started. We couldn't tell you why our family always does X or Y, or even maybe when was the first this, right? But here the Israelites knew this is what God did, and it was to be continued year after year after year as a reminder to them of what God had done. And so that's what they're going to go to Jerusalem for, is this Passover, to celebrate the Passover. And they go to Jerusalem to do this, again, as we've said, for that purpose. Now, I don't think this is Luke's point, because he doesn't highlight it. But as I was studying and looking at things, I think this is helpful. What is the significance of the Passover to Jesus? Again, Luke doesn't go into detail here. But if you're reading Luke's account and you know Jesus is with his family at the time of the Passover in Jerusalem, what might we be able to say, well, hey, there's something interesting here about this? What is the connection between Jesus and the Passover? Okay, so they offer up a lamb, right? They paint the blood saves them, and Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. He is the way to salvation. He is the reason why there is still hope. There's one more I thought of. Anybody else have one? So let me mention the other one here. Jesus dies at the time frame of the Passover. Remember when Jesus and his disciples gather together for that Last Supper, what Last Supper are they in that time frame of? It's the Passover time frame. That's what they're in. So think about this. Here is Jesus at the age of 12. And in 21-ish or so years, we think Jesus lived to be about 33, he's going to be back in this same place. But instead, he'll be eating with his disciples and then hung on a cross during this same time frame. And so we've got what Craig brought up. We've got the blood. We've got Jesus. The Passover is going to be a significant event for Jesus. But again, that's not what Luke highlights for us. Luke doesn't go into some great dissertation on the Passover and Jesus' connection to this. Instead, he takes us a different direction, and it's to Jesus in the temple. And so once Jesus' family leaves, he remains behind, and they travel about a day's distance away. And so they think, you travel, they say, 20 to 30 miles, and if you have kids, you're not getting near the mileage you could get on foot. And so I don't know how far away they got, but they're in a group. They get far enough away that they're a day's journey away, and they realize Jesus is not here. And for any parent that's lost a child for any short amount of time, you know that feeling. It's not pleasant to lose a child for any amount of time, but imagine you know that they're not with you, and they're likely a day's journey back. And I would guess that they got back to Jerusalem faster than they got to where they were, because that's how you move when you've got a lost kid. So they get back, and they don't find him until eventually they find Jesus, and he's in the temple, which is not a place that I would expect a lot of 12-year-olds to gravitate toward. But he's in the temple, and he is engaging with the religious leaders, and he's listening to them, and he's asking them questions. Now, it doesn't say that Jesus is up there and he's preaching to them, but I want you to think about this. What does a child asking questions tell us about that child? Okay, he's interested. And when he's asking the questions, people are astonished, which leads me to believe, right, that he's doing something that we see on occasion, which is someone is asking the kinds of questions that make you understand they get stuff. He's asking, I would assume, insightful questions. And go back to the text. It says In verse 47, and all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. So even he's responding to some of this stuff as well. And so something is happening here that's catching attention. It's both of the religious leaders, even of Jesus' parents. When they get there, they're astonished about this as well. What I find interesting is Jesus seemingly has grown up in obscurity, right? Because it's not like Jesus is in the temple here and they're saying, hey, we heard about you. You were born in Bethlehem, and we heard about the angel coming to there's nothing. I don't think they know who he is. They just know there's this kid, and he's very much engaged with what's going on amongst this conversation. We get the full picture. We see all of this. His parents show up. They see all of this, and they don't get it. They don't understand, and they have a very normal parent response, which is, even if you're the reason why the kid got lost, you're still a little bit frustrated with the kid because why did you get lost? And that's kind of what the attitude is we kind of get here from Mary, right? Why did you do this? You know, don't you know what you caused us, the worry that we had here because we could not find you? And from this, we get a very interesting response from Jesus. He says this, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" Now, your translation might say about my Father's business or something like that. The language, it doesn't have all of the words that we have in English. They kind of have to supplement what's going on there, but something along the lines of, I have to be in my Father's house or my Father's business. Michael?
I don't mean to try to backtrack.
No, go ahead.
In this same context is something I think that's very important for us to realize about people trying to figure out who Jesus was early on.
Yeah.
And that is the fact that the Bible says that first that he was listening to them and then asking them questions. But right after that, it says that they were amazed at his understanding and his answers.
Yeah.
So that leads me to believe possibly that they might have been, since you seem to be so interested, what do you think this means? Or asking him the kind of questions that, well, you know, not to bring a 12-year-old to shame, but just to see if he has any idea what the answer is.
Yeah.
And he absolutely has the answers.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you think about the ministry of Jesus throughout the Gospels, a lot of what he engages in is questions and answers. People ask him questions, and he gives answers, and sometimes he asks questions. And what's interesting about the questions of Jesus is they're the kinds of questions that aren't always comfortable. He sometimes brings you a question where you don't necessarily like where it's going to lead you. In fact, one of the most interesting ones is when Jesus is asked, by whose authority are you doing these things, when he's doing some things around the temple. And he asks them, well, let me ask you a question. John's baptism, where did it come from? From heaven or from men? And as they're reasoning, they're like, we can't answer that question. We don't like where that question's going to lead, what the conclusion is, and so they don't answer. And so this is maybe in a sense, right? You see young people sometimes, and you could say, I bet they're going to be like this. And this is maybe a little window into that is kind of how Jesus operated.
Just got to add that statement that after that particular time, they determined not to ask him any questions.
Right. And we've all been there, right? Where you know what? We've had conversations, we've asked questions, and there's some people you're like, you know what? I'm not bringing that up anymore. That doesn't work out well for me. Mike?
Yeah, so I've always had similar thoughts to Michael. Like, what was their response watching this kid, essentially a religious child prodigy,
Yeah.
in their presence? Because we got to remember the temple wasn't just a religious site, it was also an educational site. And I always wondered, why didn't they scoop that kid up and say,
Yeah.
we're training you?
Right.
And always kind of wrote it off as maybe elitism or something, as you mentioned, this kid
Right.
from Nazareth. But as you were talking about traveling so far away and losing their community, and their parents having a very human response,
Yeah.
maybe that's just God working behind the scenes to quickly get Jesus out of that situation because it's not his time yet.
Yeah, we don't, God doesn't explain everything to us. He doesn't walk us through every piece and say, here's why I did X and here's why I did Y and all of that. But you look at this, and again, why does Luke record this? And I think part of this is Jesus, we've already seen in the last chapter, or in the earlier part of this chapter, the shepherds declare who Jesus is. Gabriel does in the first chapter. The shepherds do after the message from the angel. Simeon shares that this is the salvation of both the Gentile and the Jews. Anna shares about this idea of being thankful for him as well. Now here is Jesus at the age of 12 recognizing that he is also the Son of God. And Mike, to your point, what growing up in obscurity may have allowed, I don't know, but it may have not been, it didn't fit, whatever reason, it didn't fit for him to grow up in that time, in the temple, in that area, learning like, that wasn't what God did. God basically sent him off into a place of not any great importance, to learn and to grow and to develop. But here we see Jesus says, did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? He grasps at some level of, this is who I am. Even as a 12-year-old. And again, it's hard to get our head around all of this because, again, the idea of, the picture is not that Jesus, he was born and Jesus, was talking. He came, he was birthed and then he began to speak because he's Jesus. Well, I mean, it seems like he grew. He grew like we do. He limited himself in some, I don't know fully what all that looks like, but here we get at least part of this is even at an early age, right? He understood who he was. Nancy?
So who in the world trained Jesus as he was growing up? He had to have education somewhere.
Well, and this is, so the end of this, let me go to the next part of this because it kind of hits on this. So they don't get it. Mary and Joseph don't get it. To Mike's point, they don't say, hey, you know what, you are something special. We're going to keep you here, right? Get the best training, all of that kind of thing. Instead, it interestingly enough says, and he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. So he lived as a kid. And he goes back home to Nazareth, and then kind of to your point, Nancy, about, well, this what happens with this growth. It says that he continued to grow, and it says that he increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. Now, some of that comes as you just develop, obviously, but were Joseph and Mary, we know that they, from the previous text, that they followed the law. They go and take him to the temple to do the offerings when he's born. They're there for the Passover, and so maybe it was just homegrown. They were giving him things, and as he grew in wisdom and gained understanding, it's hard to get our minds around, how that fully worked, because he is God in the flesh. How all that fit together, I don't know, but the text would indicate that he operated in the same situation that everybody would have done, which is in his household under his parents. Craig?
If there was a synagogue in the town, which I believe there probably was, he probably would, like with all the other children his age, been going and being instructed.
Yeah, and learning. And again, we all know kids that they're just sharp, right? They grasp things quickly. I would guess Jesus was that on steroids, if you will. I mean, he got it in a way that obviously explains who he is there.
Well, that makes me happy. When I go to heaven, I'm going to ask all a bunch of questions.
There's a lot of questions that we'll have.
I don't know.
Right.
I want to know.
Yeah.
I mean, were angels coming down to heaven training it all? Doesn't it?
Jesus, again, you walk through this, and outside of this one little instance, he just sounds very ordinary. He grew up in a community, and he was submissive to his parents. Just not what you would expect in some regard. Ron?
I was thinking, as growing up as a child, first of all, when did he actually become aware that he was the Son of God?
Sure.
Secondly, as he grew in humanity
Yeah.
to understand what it was like to be a human being.
Yeah, and one of the things we're going to talk about in just a minute is that idea of being submissive. Even Jesus, right, was submissive to his own parents. And so we talk about Jesus as fully God and fully man, and that's, kind of like the Trinity. It's hard to get your head around all of that. But it's these kinds of things like this that show us, well, he was a person. I mean, he lived a human life like we do in those ways. Dave?
He probably was not a miraculous like that, some of the apocryphal books, because
Yeah.
when he goes back and he's basically a prophet that's to his hometown, they
Yeah.
accept him.
Yeah.
Isn't this, Joseph's son, and,
Right.
so we know his brothers and sisters and all. Well, he wasn't extraordinary, and so he did live most of his life as kind of an ordinary human being.
Yeah, so actually I want to take that because this is something that I got highlighted in the next point. So next Sunday we're going to talk about Luke 3, 1 through 22 with the ministry of John. John is the preparer of the way for Jesus. We'll talk about that next week. But I want to fast forward to verse 21 here, and about the baptism and the genealogy of Jesus. And to Dave, to your point, when John comes, John's message is that the Messiah is coming next. But what do people think about John? What's kind of the issue? What's the hubbub surrounding John?
They think he's the one.
That is maybe this the guy, right? He's got this message. He seems like the kind of guy who he is a powerful speaker, and people are wondering, are you the guy? And John tells them, I'm not the guy, right? But to Dave's point, he doesn't say, hey, remember this guy that's been doing miracles his whole life that you've seen grown up? He doesn't say that. Those stories in Nazareth that you've heard of the boy who, he doesn't say any of that. He simply points them to there is going to come one, and the impression, I guess, my opinion, but the impression I'm left with is that Jesus has not been doing the types of things that would have led everyone to believe, I bet he's the guy. It seems more like he's just kind of grown up. And John is now having to direct people, this is the Messiah.
And even Jesus' own brothers seemed shocked that Jesus was coming out and claiming all this, indicating just normal people.
Right, and so we get through all of, again, we'll talk about John's ministry next week, but when you walk through this, it seems like Jesus lived a normal life. We say that, we could say normal, and all of us have stories. We'd be like, well, I don't think that's normal. Our normal is all different, but he lived a human life up to this point, and then he became the focus, right, that he stepped into that role that he was born into this earth to fulfill, and then all of this begins to continue forward from there. Let's read the text really quickly. 21. Now, when all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized and was praying, the heavens were open, and the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased." Now, this begins in, look at verse 23, and Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph. So, again, we get one basic account in the life of Jesus from around his birth time period, and shortly thereafter, he's 12, and then he's 30. That's it. And we fast forward to this, and it's at the baptism of Jesus, and it's here once again we have another declaration of who Jesus is. This one's from God himself. And so remember, at the very beginning of the book, if you go back to chapter 1 and verse 4 or 5, verse 4, Luke is writing to Theophilus that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. So again, there's just evidence after evidence after evidence that Jesus is the Son of God from the get-go, and not just from one source. You've got shepherds that were proclaiming it because they'd heard it from an angel. You have Zechariah getting a message about John and about the Messiah coming. You get Mary's message from Gabriel. You get Simeon in the temple. You get Anna in the temple. You get Jesus in the temple. And now you get God speaking from heaven, "This is my Son." And so again, there's not a point where Jesus became the Son of God. He was the Son of God the whole time. He was the Son of God. He did not become the Son of God. He was the Son of God. God declares it. Jesus spoke it. The angels declared it. You have all these different things. And so we get this picture here, and then we get the very normal side, and it's kind of to Dave's thought earlier as well. He was the supposed son of Joseph. Right? So you get this picture of, as far as humanly speaking, people could tell he was Joseph's son. And so when he begins to do things, there's this pushback. Wait a second, we know this guy. We know his family. We know his siblings and all of this. And that can't be. It doesn't make much sense. Ron?
Jesus, the Pharisees and all that, they said, "Isn't he the son of a carpenter?"
Yeah.
He grew up as a normal man. He should be a normal man, but he has this spirituality about him that makes him totally
and so remember when Jesus, if you remember the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, do you remember what it says about the people? After Jesus finishes preaching, there's that one verse at the end that's kind of not Jesus talking, but it's talking about Jesus' preaching. You remember what it says about Jesus? So verse 28 of chapter 7. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. A carpenter's son, right? To Mike's point, not trained in the temple, not trained by the greatest teachers, that they would expect that, right? You think about Paul. Why is Paul so impressive? He was well studied. Paul was the guy who, if there was going to be a guy to know the ways of God, it was a guy like Paul, trained under one of the great teachers, all of this. And here is Jesus from Nazareth, a carpenter's son, and he's speaking with authority that even the scribes don't have. Does not fit the mold of what we would expect. Larry?
It seems like I should already know the answer to this question, but I actually don't. So does everybody know that Joseph's not really his father?
At this point, I would say no. That's not assumed by everyone. But Luke wants us to understand that this is, Joseph was not his birth father, if you will. And he walks us through the lineage, essentially, of Jesus. There's some debate. There's two different ones. One's in Matthew, one is in Luke, and they're slightly different. I believe they match up again at David, from David all the way backwards in time, but in that intervening time from David on to Jesus, there's some differences, and they think one of them is Mary's and one is Joseph's lineage. This is what they think, but we don't know for sure. But I want you to read, we're not going to read the whole thing because we're getting low on time, but I want you to read the very end of the genealogy with me, chapter 3. You'll recognize some of these names. We'll just start in verse 36. The son of Canaan, the son of Arphaxad, the son of Shem, the son of Noah, the son of Lamech, the son of Methuselah, the son of Enoch, the son of Jared, the son of Mahalalel, the son of Canaan, the son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. And so Luke chooses in his genealogy to take us all the way back to Adam, who is also called a son of God. And so obviously there's a sense in which we are all sons of God in one sense, and yet Jesus obviously is very unique in that sense as well. Now we've got just a few minutes left, and so I want to highlight just a few things. As I mentioned, this is the kind of text that's a little easier to teach through than preach through, but I do think there is application. I do think there are a few things for us to focus in on here, and so I want to mention two of them that are, I think, bigger, one of them that's just kind of a small minor point. The first one is this: God works in his own way. God works in his own way, doing plans in his own fashion. Again, there's all kinds of debate within the world that the whole thing that we believe, the whole of Christianity is fabricated, right? That people just made it up. This is not the kind of story we would make up. If you were making up a story, you wouldn't make up this story. It doesn't make much sense to make it up this way, because so much of it you'd be like, nah, that wouldn't work that way. That's not accurate, but God is doing something, and it doesn't fit what we would expect, but he's working in that way. And so here you have Jesus, who's the Son of God, the Messiah, and he seemingly lives in relative obscurity for the first 30 years of his life. We wouldn't expect that. We wouldn't write it that way, but that's what he did. Now, why? Why is that the case? And I don't know. I don't know for sure. Bowles, in his commentary, pointed to Numbers 4 and verse 3 that talks about the priests not starting until they were 30. Maybe. I saw somebody else mention, maybe it was at 30 that Jesus could begin to teach and influence. They'd listen to him at that point, which does make a little bit of sense. I think if somebody got up this morning that was 16 and tried to share a message, it might be dismissed pretty easily because, well, they're just 16. Or you know what I mean? Sometimes there's a little bit of age that lends a little bit more weight to what's being spoken. So maybe that's why he waited that long. Obviously, God had a reason for it, but it doesn't fit our plan. It doesn't fit what we would create there. Nancy?
Also the time where rabbis, were started. They started about 30 years of age. And so he didn't have any of the rabbi teachings, but about that age is where they start collecting. He was called rabbi, and he had his group that followed him, which was very normal for rabbis to do. So
yeah, I didn't read about that time frame specifically about the age for rabbis. I didn't see that, but to your point, when you look at Jesus' ministry, that's what he's filling that role of a rabbi with followers, with those who are listening to him, and he is this. He's uniquely gifted because of who he is. And as we look at all of this, what I want to kind of just draw attention to is God does not operate in the ways that we would expect. He just doesn't do that. And what that means is that we have to kind of be open to not understanding everything or realizing that we don't understand everything. Just recently, we talked about 2 Peter chapter 3. And in 2 Peter 3, there's a conversation that Peter kind of points to a future, sometime in the near future, when people are going to be talking about, when is this coming, right? You know, the things are continuing on as they have from the fathers. When is he actually going to come? And it gives the impression almost that people are like kind of disbelieving. They're going to come to disbelieve because things are going on as they always have. And now here we are almost 2,000 years after that, and it's kind of like, you could see why people do that, right? I mean, come on. If he was really going to do something, would he really wait 2,000 years to do so? And yet what Peter basically says is, with God, a day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. Now, what does he mean? Well, I think what he's getting at least in part, right, is God doesn't work on the time frame that we do. That God does not say, hey, okay, you know what, it's been a really long time. No, the time doesn't work the same way for God. He sees it differently, and so it may take us thousands of years for something to unfold, but for God, it's exactly when it needs to. And it's not running late, it's not he's got to hurry, this is when it's going to happen, and so we have to view things differently. That doesn't fit. The other thing is even the gospel itself. What does 1 Corinthians say about the gospel? The message of the cross is what? Foolishness to the Greeks, a stumbling block to the Jews. Even the very message of Jesus isn't something that people just hear and they're like, this is exactly right. I knew it. You knew that the Messiah was going to come and die on a cross? No, that wasn't what was expected, and yet that is how God chose to save the world, was to send his Son to die, to shed his own blood for humanity, for sinful humanity. And so much of how God works is not the story that we craft or the way that we would expect. And so let me just ask us, what do we make application-wise from that? If God does not always operate the way that we expect, what should that then make us think, change how we live? What do you think about that?
Our culture today, in our world today.
Yeah, this is God. God works. He continues to work, and you might not always notice. And it might not be what you would expect it to be, but he's still working, Larry.
Expect the unexpected. That's it.
When you look at Scripture, I think we would expect to read something to the effect of, followers of Jesus are richly blessed, and you can rest assured that he's going to smooth the way for you. Your life is going to be easy. But he doesn't say that. Now, there's obviously, in the end, that will be true. But he doesn't. He says, James chapter 1, count it all joy when you meet trials. Count it all joy when you meet trials. We wouldn't expect that. That's not what's anticipated. And so when we look at it, we say, well, man, I'm struggling right now. And we would say, God has forsaken me. But has he? You see, we don't see things clearly sometimes because it's not what we expect. We have to be mindful. Just because it feels a certain way doesn't mean it is a certain way, because God doesn't always do what we expect him to do. Mike?
A secondary point we can pull from that is that Scripture is truthful and inspired. Because if this was penned by a human mind, it would have been, as you said, written very differently. The apocryphal texts show that there's kind of a human desire to fill in these gaps. But a human didn't write it, and so we can have confidence in it.
Yeah, and this is where we come into Scripture. We see this is God making clear his character and his nature, and there are things about God that we can know. This is the good news, right? The message this morning is not, hey, God does all kinds of things, and he does what's unexpected, so just you don't know what's going to happen. It's not exactly that. It's that we know parts of the character or the nature of God. That is foundational, right? So what that means is when the things happen that I don't expect to happen, I base my conclusion of those things on the things that I know to be true. This is God. This is his nature. So we know when something happens that I'm struggling with, it's not because God is doing wickedness and sinning, because that's not how God does things, right? And so, again, God doesn't always do what we expect. He works in his own way, but it fits the character of God, right? In what he's doing in either molding us or shaping us or growing us, those kinds of things. Larry?
you're knocked out, you're in the gutter, you're drinking whatever's coming down the gutter, it's still, it's toilet water, that's where you are. And God's right there to pick you up and stand you back on your feet. Okay, Larry, let's keep going.
Yeah, God,
We're still going together, we're doing this together.
God works. He works in our lives. Again, not always in ways that we anticipate. So when we're struggling and where things are difficult, again, we have to go and recognize what has God said about himself, who he is, and how he works. Let me mention two more things really quickly, and then we'll be done. Jesus grew. Nothing shocking there. But it specifically highlights he grew in wisdom and in favor with God and man. The favor with God and wisdom, he mentions twice there. And I want to just mention this briefly just to say, growing in wisdom is a good thing. Jesus grew in wisdom. We should grow in wisdom. And thankfully, the Bible is filled with wisdom. That's why we soak it into what Zach highlighted this morning. The word is powerful. It does produce and bear fruit in the lives of people. The other thing I wanted to mention, and we talked about this briefly on Wednesday night, at least the idea of this, was submission. So on Wednesday night, we were finishing up our study of Hebrews, and in 13 and 17, we're told to be submissive to our leaders within the body. And we see here Jesus was submissive, and we don't like this idea of being submissive. We don't like the idea of giving someone authority. And again, I've got 4 kids, all of which at some point probably think they know better than I do, right? And if you go back to your own childhood, at some point you thought, I know more than mom and dad. And maybe right now you're still like, I did know more than mom and dad. We struggle, right? We kind of assume I know what is best. And so you say, well, why don't they just listen all the time? Because they think they're right and you're wrong, right? And here's Jesus. And if there was any teenager that could have ever said, I know more than you, it was Jesus. He could have said that, but instead the text tells us that he left with them and he was submissive to them. And he went and he lived the life of a child. He was submissive to them, and I think ultimately he chose to do that. He chose to live in submission to his parents, Mary and Joseph. Again, until the age of 30, he just lived seemingly, from what we can tell from the text, an ordinary life. And so if Jesus can submit, I think we can too. Right? We won't like the idea of it, but if Jesus can choose to submit to his own parents, then whatever God has called us to submit to, once again, we see an example of what he calls us to, God understands, right? Now, there's a sense in which God is not submissive to anything else, but there is an understanding that God also chose, in the form of Christ, to submit, even to his own parents. And so this is another, I think, just thing to bounce around your head. Keep that in mind. I want to mention 2 things, and then we'll be done. Number 1, so next week is Luke 3, if you want to read ahead to the ministry of John. And then we're starting a new series on Wednesday nights that I want to just briefly talk about. So we're going to be talking about Christians and technology. And as I've studied for this, technology is way bigger than what we use. Technology is like the chair you're sitting in, and the car you drove to get here, and the phone in your pocket, and the shovel that you use at some point to dig for, technology is a ton of different things. I'm not covering technology across the whole spectrum of humanity, okay? We'd never end. We're going to be focusing on dealing with technology in relation to a lot of the things that we deal with today, with phones and with the internet. And really the idea is, how do we address things that are new, things that if I said this morning, hey, how should Christians use AI? And you say, well, let me flip over to where, right? That's the question. How do we answer those kinds of issues where we don't have a verse that you can go and God says, thou shalt not use AI or whatever? How do we answer that? And so we're going to spend this coming Wednesday night kind of dealing with some principles for answering questions that we don't have maybe that kind of an answer to. And then we'll take a week off for Christmas. And then after that, we'll come back and we'll get specific with some specific areas. And if you have any specific issues that come to mind for you, I won't guarantee you I'll talk about them, but if you want to share them, I'll see if I can figure out how to make all that fit together. And hopefully, as we go through this, we'll be able to address some things that not only are good for us, but even the generations that are coming up, that they're going to be just inundated with this stuff that maybe in a way that we haven't been or haven't had to be. So that's something that's coming up for us as well. That was my rapid fire announcement. We'll pray, and then we'll be done for this morning. Thank you for being here for class. Father, we thank you so much for your love for us, for sending your Son. We thank you for the sacrifice that he made on our behalf. I pray that as we go into this week, that we would remember that there is an eternity beyond this life, that we would remember that you have opened up a door, an opportunity, a hope for us that was impossible apart from your Son. We thank you for giving us that hope. Pray that we would live in light of that each day. Bless our week. Bless us to pay attention to those around us, to be a light, and to be a people who are serving you, doing the good works that you have prepared for us to do. Father, thank you so much for this day, this time of fellowship.